Hello, guys. Listen, I'm here in Romania, and I got a story to tell. And I'm going to be telling this story, and it's going to be very interesting. My life is really very interesting. Let me show you. This is a look down on the balcony, out over Romania, out over the traffic. As you can see, I don't know how well you can hear me, but it's all beginning right here. Something really new and something big that I'm going to do on this particular channel, and you can follow it. I really need you guys. I need your help to make this a success, and it's very, very important to me that it does become a success, you know. I'm going to tell you a story right now, and I'm going to go inside to tell you because it's quieter in there and you can be able to hear me better. I'm going to tell you the story about how I got my first job, you know. And this is going to slowly lead you into the story that's unfolded and the reason why I'm in Romania and the history behind what's actually happening here, you know, and what's actually going to happen with me in my life, you know, and what I'm going to try to do. And this story is going to be unfolding in Canada, and it's going to be unfolding in the United States of America. I'm going to be heading back to Canada pretty soon, and I'm going to be heading down to the United States, and I'm going to be doing things to try to make it interesting for this channel. I'm going to be doing a show on this channel, and right now what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to build up a viewer base again on this channel. I'm going to really be working hard on this channel. Got a lot of things I want to do. I'm tell you the truth, I'm kind of excited about what I'm doing here. And let me go inside and let's talk about how I got my first job, and I'll tell you the story. Come on inside the room here where it's quiet. You see, as soon as I shut the door here, the traffic sound's gone. Okay? I'll sit down here and I'll tell you the story, how I got my first job. I'll tell you, I was only 14 years old, you know? And I was going to a school in Umatilla, Florida, a high school. Now, they used to bus me about 20 miles through the woods from where I lived on a road that was called State Route 42. And they had a big old yellow bus, and the kids were all on the bus, and they used to bus me into school every day. Well, they also bused a bunch of kids in from a place called the Florida State Youth Ranch. And it was a correctional facility for young juvenile offenders. And a lot of these boys, you know, and the young juvenile offenders were 17, 18 years old. And actually what they were men. Well, I was just a kid. I was only 14 years old, you know. And, you know, I'm going to tell you, I was what's called a Jehovah's Witness back then. I was a Jehovah's Witness kid. And I'm going to tell you, they hated. The other kids at school hated Jehovah's Witness kids. And I think I know why now. Years later, I think I know why they hated them so bad. They hated them because when their parents were at home, you know, on Sunday and Saturday, the only days their parents really got to sleep in, about 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, the Jehovah's Witness people would come knocking on their door trying to preach the message of the religion that they were in. And the parents, you know, be waking up, you know, they wanted to sleep, you know. They'd be waking up about 7 o'clock in the morning when they wanted to sleep till 10 or 11, you know, and they would be mad. And they'd say, that damn Jehovah's Witness people, and they'd be mad. They'd be going around the house after the Jehovah's Witnesses left. They'd be mad. And the kids would hear their parents' anger. So then the kids would go to school and they'd say, you know, they didn't know why, but they knew the parents hated Jehovah's Witnesses because they woke them up in the morning. And then they'd take it out on any Jehovah's Witness kid that lived in the school. That would kind of be a rub-off effect from the parents to the kids, you know. So I went into school there, and I was going in with these juvenile delinquents, you know, that were already young offenders. And they had already committed crimes that were worthy felonies. And they were a lot bigger and stronger than me, you know. And I was only one of 2 Jehovah's Witness kids in that school. So it's obvious I was going to come under some flack. I used to try to basically hide all day. That was my method of, but I had a few friends. One of the friends I had was this nerdy kid, you know, who used to always go to the cafeteria and read comic books. He loved like Spider-Man and Batman and all this stuff. And I kind of like comic books too, you know. I used to trade him a comic book here and there, you know. So, and we were pretty good friends, you know. I think his name was Dana or something like that. Anyway, one day I went in there and into the cafeteria. And he said to me, listen, he said, you know that guy David or whatever that's the leader of these young thugs, these young hoodlums that are bussed in from the boys' ranch. He said, tomorrow, I heard them talking, he said. About tomorrow, he said, they're going to haul you off into the orange grove. And I'm not going to say, because I don't want this video to be demonetized. But anyway, he said, you're in big trouble. And this guy, David, had been making my life a living misery, you know. He'd been hunting me, trying to find me, and then they would basically bully me. So anyway, I knew what he was saying was true. I knew I was going to be in big trouble the next day. This guy was going to hunt me down. And I mean, I was only 14 years old. Now, how does a 14-year-old deal with this, you know? So the next day, I had to go to school, you know. And so I had to head down to the bus stop, and there was a fairly long dirt road to walk down, and then it went on to a paved road, and I walked down the paved road down to the corner where the bus stop was. And so I was walking down that road, and I was thinking into my head, you know, what was going to happen. And I was like, whoa. And I noticed as I was walking on that sand, you know, in the wintertimes in Florida, it's very, very dry. And there was a bit of dew out that morning, and the trees were all covered with a bit of dew. And it's kind of cold, it's about 50 degrees, and the sun was out, and the sky was blue and everything, you know. But it wasn't real cold, and it was warming up fast, because in Florida, after the night, it was a cool night, but the next day it warms up to like 60 or 70 degrees in the winter, 70 maybe. So it's it's fairly warm. And I was walking down that road, and I noticed I was walking slower, slower, and slower, slower on that soft sand, that white sand, powdery sand road. And the sand was dry that time of year because it hadn't rained in a long time. My feet were kind of squishing down into the sand, a little bit of dew on the top of the sand and everything. So I was walking down that road slower and slower, and, you know, I kept going until all of a sudden I come to a complete stop. And I just stood there in the middle of that sand road. I was supposed to go down to catch the bus. So anyway, I just couldn't do it. My feet wouldn't move. I stood there and I looked at the sky and I looked at the trees and everything else, you know. I was like, I can't do it. I just can't do it. I can't go in there. I just stood there for maybe 4 minutes. And all of a sudden, I just turned to the right. Now, back in those days, there was brush everywhere. Not many houses were in there yet. And there was like scrub brush, what they call scrub brush. It's about 15, quite high, about 15 feet high. It's really dense. And that's what the woods is down there. It's scrub brush. And so there's a whole scrub brush lot to the right of me. It's scrub brush. And there's a person had a house built to the left of me. I turned right and headed toward the scrub brush and started walking toward the scrub brush. And it's almost like my feet were moving me there, and I didn't really know what I was going to do. I was just walking. I walked into the scrub brush deep enough where nobody could see where I was. And I was in the woods there. And all of a sudden, I felt kind of like a peace settle over me. Kind of like very peaceful. And I just laid down on the sand. And the soft sand in Florida kind of squished under my back, kind of like I was kind of squished down into it. It was kind of like a bed, you know? And I was still a little bit sleepy because it was early morning. I had to catch the bus. And I just kind of went to sleep there on the sand. And it's very, very peaceful. I think it was the most peaceful thing I've ever done in my life. And I went to sleep. So I must have been a couple hours went by, and I woke up, you know. And it was a kind of a disoriented feeling, waking up in that scrub brush. And there was these little birds. They had flown right down in and practically landed on top of me, and there's little birds fluttering all around me, and I didn't move. They were all around me, these little birds, like they were singing songs and everything else. And it was like I went from hell into heaven in one swift move. And I felt such a relief, you know, that I didn't have to meet up with this David character who, gosh knows, you know, what would have happened. Anyway, I felt such relief over me, you know, and I just laid there and I was enjoying the moment. These little birds flying around and everything else, you know. It was very, very peaceful. So anyway, the next morning I did the same damn thing. But this time I had plans, you know, I had plans. I went in and I took a piece of canvas from my dad. You know, he had an old canvas tent. I cut a piece off the old tent. I mean, he wasn't going to use it anyway. And I got a couple tent poles, and I got a few other things, and I wrapped it all up in a bag or whatever. And when I went in, I had some stuff with me. I had a little radio, and I had a few other stuff, some food, and I had a little like a little knapsack. And I went into the woods there, and quite seriously, I started to build a little tiny shelter near the ground, you know, close to the ground, right on the ground, out of these. Out of the canvas and stuff like that. And I stayed in there. And you know what? I built a little house in there, basically. And I went in there every single day for like 2 weeks. Well, after about 2 weeks went by, the school noticed that I wasn't coming to school. And they sent a letter to my mother. They said, we're sending out the truant officer. You know, now I was getting almost 15 years old, and by Florida state law at that time, once you turned 15, you didn't have to go to school anymore. That was the law. But I wasn't 15 yet, so they sent the truant officer out to get me. They come talk to my mother and everything else. And my mother said, it's only like 2 months until you turn 15, she said, and then you don't have to go to school anymore. And she was upset at me at first. I never did tell her about the David guy or anything, but she said to me, there's nothing really I can do with you. She said, I can't force you to go to school against your will. She said, if you're not going to go to school, what are you going to do? And I didn't really have an answer for her. She said, I know what you can do. She said, you can go to work with your father every day. So she said, will you do that? And I said, yeah, okay, I will. So what happened was I took off the first morning to head to work with my father. And, you know, it was probably the greatest experience of my life. You know, we had this little, I forget what car it was. I think it was a little Pinto, a little green Pinto. And we piled into the car, and we left the driveway that first morning heading to work. He worked at a place called Terry's Auto Body Shop in Orlando, Florida. Southern Orlando. This is the south end of Orlando, you know. And it was about an hour's drive. So we left and we drove up to I-4. We got on the I-4, you know, and we put the car up to like 60 miles an hour, you know, and we were two men sailing into town, you know, together. I had my arm out the window, you know, and we were talking back and forth about a lot of stuff, you know. And we were sailing down there. We got into Orlando, and I started to smell the smell. You know, it was the old Merita Bread Factory, and they were baking fresh bread, and we drove by the Merita Bread Factory. And did that ever smell good? I'm telling you, that fresh bread they were making at Merita Bread Factory. I think it was a Merita Bread Factory, anyway. Drove by the Merita Bread Factory, and then we drove into Terry's. And you know, it's a completely different world. The world of the men rather than the world of the boys. You know, I'm going to tell you what about boys. Boys are awful cruel animals, you know. And even young men are very cruel animals. And that school I was in was almost like a prison camp. But being at work and being at a job, the men treated me altogether different. They treated me with respect there. They treated my father with respect, you know. And it was actually a good work environment. There was about 8 men working there in different stalls. They had these, what they call stalls. Now, my father was the best auto body mechanic there. All the other men had one stall. My father had two stalls because he could get the cars out faster than anybody, you know. So, and the owner there used to favor my father a little bit because he's the best man. So he said he wasn't really keen on the idea of hauling me into work because I was underage. I didn't have a Social Security card, I don't think, yet. And I was starting to work in there. And so Terry, the owner, he said to my father, he said, you know, I can't take him on. He said he's underage. My father said, you know what? He said, just let him work, he said, and we'll pay him as we go. We'll pay him $10 a day. Terry said, well, okay, we'll pay him $10 a day. Where's it going to come from? He said, well, you can take it out of my wage, my father said. He'll make it that much faster for me if I have him helping me. Terry said, okay. Now, I'm going to tell you what. Back in those days, $10 is not like it is today. Back in those days, $10 was about like maybe $70 today. It's quite seriously, right? And because my father and mother were paying all my expenses at home, it wasn't too bad a deal, you know. So I worked hard, and I was learning a trade. My dad was teaching me how to fix these cars. And the guys in there were good to me. There was this one guy in there, you know, he was the painter, and he went prematurely bald, right? And he was a little fella, and he was awful nice, you know, and he's awful nice to me. I used to help him down in the paint shop and stuff. I can't remember what his name was now. Anyway, and so all of them were pretty good to me, you know. But there was one fella in there that used to make fun of me a little bit because I was a little bit chubby back then when I was a kid. I'm still a little bit chubby. He used to call me Little Elephant. He was from Puerto Rico. He was a pretty good auto body mechanic, you know. And so we were working in there, and we were enjoying. I was enjoying the job, you know. Every day, what I'd do is I'd collect all these fellas' pop bottles. And they'd just give them to me, like the old pop bottles. And there was about maybe 10 a day or 15 a day. And I used to trot them down to the store that was down the road. And I'd change them in for 10 cents each. And I used to get about 2 or 3 quarters every day. And I used to love to go to the arcade at lunchtime, play the pinball machines. You know, and oftentimes you could win a game back then on the pinball machines. You hit a certain score or you hit the bumpers just right. I got really good at those pinball machines. I used to hit those bumpers and stuff and everything. And all of a sudden the machine would, at a certain point, when you hit a certain score, the machine would go pop. It almost sounded like a baseball bat hitting a ball. That was the sound it would make, and that would be an extra game. Well, after I was there about a year or two, I got so good at those pinball machines, just 1 quarter was all I needed. I could go up there and I could hit all the targets and everything, and the machine would just start popping those pop, 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 pop extra games. And I'd leave about 4 or 5 games on the machine when I had to head back to work every day. But they'd always find me up there playing those pinball machines up at the arcade, up at I forget what the store's name was right now. Anyway, maybe J.C. Fields or something like that. Well, I think it might have been Fields, the name of the store anyway, where they had the pinball machine. So I'd walk up there, and I'd walk back to the shop to start working again in the afternoon. Soon I'd saved myself enough money where I was able to actually buy myself a stereo. Back in those days, stereos were a big thing, and they were expensive. Bought myself a Hitachi stereo for my bedroom, you know. And I was starting to live the good life because I was starting to learn how to do auto body repair, and I was getting better at it. And my dad was letting me have more and more of the jobs, especially paint work and stuff. He would get it roughed out, you know. He would rough out the big dents, and he'd fill them with Bondo. That's the stuff that they used to fill auto body repair with, you know. What they do basically is they tap out the dent, and then they will shrink the metal with using heat and a special kind of hammer, and then they'll grind all the paint off, and then they'll apply this spread stuff they call Bondo. It's like a mixture of it's almost like peanut butter when they mix it up, but when they spread it on over these dents, it hardens after about a half an hour, and then it can be sanded and then resanded and apply more coats until finally it's almost like plastering, you know. Similar, but they're trying to obtain the original shape of what the car had. And then they put a coat of spray paint over it and stuff. So what my dad would do is he would rough these out with the Bondo and get them all nice and smooth and everything, and then give them to me to smooth them further to where the point where they could send them to the paint shop. And that was my job. And it saved my dad a lot of time, you know. And so in the end, my dad's salary was actually going up higher than the $10 he was paying me. And I was getting really good at fixing these cars. Really good at fixing these cars. Now, at that time, you know, my grandfather, he worked over at a different dealership. He was the body shop manager of a dealership called Norman Brothers Nissan in Orlando. And I was 17 by that time, you know. But I still didn't have my papers quite yet. I didn't have my driver. I think I had my Social Security then, but I didn't have my driver's license yet. You know, I didn't know how to drive quite yet. I was just learning, getting ready to get my license to drive. So I went over there to Nissan Brothers, and I hired on for my first real job as an auto body mechanic. And I was pretty darn good, you know. So there was about 6 auto body mechanics there at Nissan Brothers. And I remember back then in those days, Nissan Brothers, they were repairing these cars that had been completely demolished. So my grandfather, he took me out into the back and he said, "See that car over there?" And it was like a Nissan Sentra, one of these Nissans. And it looked like the thing had been in a crusher. He said, "Can you fix that?" He said, "I'll hire you on if you can fix that." And I said, "Yeah, I can fix that." You know? And they were doing these cars back in those days. It wasn't illegal yet. It was called clips. What they basically were, they called it a clip. Basically, they'd take one car that had been hit in the rear end, one car that had been hit in the front end. They'd saw the car in half, and they would weld it back together again across the floor and across the two posts that come down for the front windshield. They cut the posts that come down for the front windshield. And my grandfather said, "I want you to do one of these clips." It hadn't become illegal yet. Now, back in a few years later, some body shops were doing these clips, and they weren't doing them right. They weren't welding them right, and the cars were actually breaking right in half on the highway. You know, one path go one way and have caused accidents. And so they said, okay, it's not legal to do clips anymore. But my grandfather said, "Can you do that car?" And my father taught me how to do a clip properly, you know. So I took that car into the shop, and I started working on it for my grandfather. It took me a little while because I watched my father do a few of them and stuff, and he knew how to do them. And so I did this work, and I was able to do a successful job on the car. And I did it properly. My father always did it properly too, you know, so it wouldn't come apart. What you had to do it properly had to do with the welds. You just couldn't spot weld them. You had to really weld them good and do a proper job of welding them so that they would hold together so that they wouldn't break apart. So anyway, I did the jobs, you know, and I worked there, and I started working there, and what I noticed was my grandfather was awfully scared that these other guys in the shop would say nepotism. He was scared of getting called out for that. So my grandfather used to always give me the harder jobs that didn't have had the least amount of money on them, and I was still outperforming these other guys in the shop. So he was giving me all the hard stuff. One of the things he used to give me was headliners, because headliners only gave like 2 hours to do a headliner, and you had to take the old headliner out, and there was an awful lot of, you had to take the seat belt clamps out, and you had to take the sun visors out, and the light that's on the ceiling and everything, and you had to take all the moldings off and everything, and you only had 2 hours labor on it. None of the other guys would touch those headliners. But, you know, I had specialty tools I put in there, and I used impact sockets and stuff. And I used to have a little game with myself where my grandfather used to say, okay, you got a headliner today, or 2 headliners today. And I'd be like, oh boy, I'm going to beat my time, I'm going to beat my time on these headliners. And I had all my tools set right there, like where I could grab them real quick in impact sockets and ring, 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 and I'd jump inside that car, and I'd put those impact sockets up to the headliner, and I'd be like, zing, 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 and the nuts and bolts would be flying every which way, And I'd have that headliner down in like 3 minutes, sitting on top of the seats, and I'd take the old headliner out, and slide the new headliner in, just like they do the production line at the factory. I got as fast as those guys at the factory, probably, as zipping that headliner in. And I got down so I could do a complete headliner in 15 minutes. 15 minutes from start to finish. And it was a 2-hour job. I was making it into gravy. Gravy was running down my chin, on those headliners. And the other guys started to get envious, So one of the guys in there got envious. He said, Tommy, my grandfather's name, he said, give me one of those headliners. He said, the young fellow over there, he's doing such a fast job on him. He said, maybe I can do it too. So he said, okay, I'll give you one of those headliners. And he was like 6 hours on it. Okay, listen, guys. I got more stories for you about times back then. Times back then were really good, and compared to what they are now, things are getting worse and worse now, And thank you guys for listening, and we'll catch you on the next show. Bye-bye, guys.